My name is Shanna Rowe Jackson, also known as Caution Artist at Play on YouTube and social media. Today, I would like to talk to you about the unique working properties of ampersand Encausticbord. Many of you know this surface to be fantastic for encaustics, but did you know that it is also a wonderful mixed media surface? Let's take a closer look. Encausticbord, like all of Ampersand's Museum Series panels, is made with a sturdy 1/8 inch hard board base. This is not to be confused with MDF or masonite. Unlike MDF and masonite, this hardboard will not warp over time, making it the most stable art substrate on the market. They also sell hardboard separately if you are somebody who likes to prime your surface yourself. Just, keep that in mind. This panel is sealed and protected with Ampersand's Archiva seal, making it non-yellowing and archival. So it truly is a museum quality panel. I love Encausticbord for its versatility. Encausticbord was developed when Ampersand teamed up with R&F Paint to create a unique working surface for encaustics. However, as I mentioned earlier, what they came up with was obviously an awesome encaustic panel, but fantastic for mixed media. It is the mixed media qualities of this panel that we will be focusing on today, more specifically how well they work with water-based markers. I have personally used this surface for acrylics, casein, but it has been my go-to surface for water-based markers because of the ease of blending that this surface allows. As we know, water-based markers don't have the best reputation for blending. I searched high and low for a fantastic surface to blend markers on, and I have finally found it in Encausticbord. So with that, I will be taking you along today as I use the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens on the Encausticbord to create a drawing of a ladybug on a leaf. And I might bring in a few other supplies here and there to beef things up a bit. So let's get to it. Okay, so starting off in the background, I am laying in a lot of cool colors. And I'm coming in with a technique that is very similar to wet into wet, because I want this to blur together and be like a bokeh background. And I want it to recede. So that's another reason why I'm using a lot of cool colors, because the foreground and the main subject being the leaf and the ladybug, I want those to be the warmer colors. I want them to stand out and have the most contrast. So I'm keeping that in mind already when I lay in my background. I am using the larger brush nibs for this because they tend to be juicier, and I want to be able to have the maximum amount of ink so I have a longer working time. So let's talk a little bit more about these markers. The Faber-Castell Pitt pens are a water-based marker, and they are India ink based. Now, why do I choose to work with water-based markers instead of alcohol-based markers? The answer is simple. I like to sell my artwork, and I want my artwork to be light fast. And you have more of a chance of your artwork being light fast if it's done with a pigment-based, water-based marker. Alcohol-based markers fade by nature, and so I wanted to find markers that would not fade on me, especially in work that I wanted to sell. And that is what initially drew me to the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens. This video, by the way, is not associated with Faber-Castell. This just happens to be my choice in water-based markers. The original Faber-Castell Pitt pens have a brush nib on them, and they recently also came out with an extension of their line called dual pens, and these pens have a thicker brush nib on one end and then a thinner fine liner nib on the other end for detail. And these are not to be confused with their Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, which would also work on these panels just fine, but I prefer to have it be a little bit more cohesive and use these with my regular Pitt pens because the ink is the same. So as you can see, I'm going in with layers and layers and layers, and that's a good thing about these. And for my initial layers, I am going in and doing the wet on wet technique like I did in the background. And as you can tell, that background, she looks like a mess. But that's intentional because I wanted it to be blurry and out of focus. And then for the leaf itself, I came in with a layer of yellow, and then I'm just going in with my leafy green color. And while it's really, really juicy, I'm fanning out a few of the brush strokes with a brush. And then I'm coming in with a colored pencil, and I am masking that edge because I don't want that edge to get covered. It stays a lighter yellow. And basically, when you use a colored pencil with water-based markers, they help mask the area. They act as a resist because wax resists water. And so I use that technique to help mask out certain areas that I want to stay put. Another technique that I really love using on this panel is sgraffito, or a scratchboard technique. And that is where you can take a scratchboard tool and carve into the panel and carve away the pigment. So even though this technically isn't a scratchboard, you can use it as such. So you can do the whole thing, like ink the whole thing, whatever colors you want, and then come through and do scratchboard techniques. And that's the technique I used for the veins on the leaf. And then I'm just coming through and working section by section. And occasionally I'll go back to my background and beef things up a little bit to help bring the leaf forward. Now, in the leaf itself, after I have my initial texture laid down, or my initial underpainting laid down, I come in with a mottled texture. I am not overly concerned with blending out this part. This leaf is variegated, and so it has a lot of blotchy marks on it. I'm using the brush strokes from my markers to do the work for me to get that texture. So in this particular part, I want it to look extra marker-y, if that makes sense. So I'm not overly blending those areas. And as you can see, I have a few smears here and there. I am using a piece of glassine under my hand to help prevent smears. I forgot to lay that down in my initial part, so I got some smears in places I didn't want it. I'm just going over it with marker. I know that that part is going to be variegated anyway. I'm not all that concerned. So I'm basically going through and lightly drawing out the spots that I want to be lighter, and then coming in with successively darker layers of green. And then in certain places where I went over a spot that I actually want to be lighter, I'm either able to lift it with a Q-tip and water, or a cotton swab and water, or I'm even able to erase certain parts. Now, normally ink isn't really erasable, but on this surface, I am able to kind of rub out some of the ink using the Faber-Castell Perfection Eraser. And then again, I'm just coming in with more of those details. In certain areas where it got a little too dark, I used my brush to lift a little. And I apologize that there's a bit of a glare. But as you can see, this panel really, really does take the ink so well, and the way it sinks in is just wonderful. One of the things that makes this panel so perfect for water-based markers is that the water is able to sit on top of the panel for a longer period of time than it would if it was watercolor paper. Normally, this ink sinks into watercolor paper, making it harder to blend. But since this panel has such a wonderful, very light coarse texture, it allows the ink to sit a little bit longer, to work a little bit longer. And that's what helps us blend. And now I'm going in and working on the ladybug. I'm coming in with my reds, and then I'm also using a little bit of that leaf green for the shadow areas on the ladybug. Green and red are opposite each other on the color wheel, so a great way to do shading with those colors is to use either green in the red to lightly shadow things, or vice versa. It dulls things down, but not as bad as it would if I were to jump right in and only use black to shadow it. And I apologize, red doesn't show up as well on camera. There is more detail than what is showing here. It kind of washes out a little bit on camera. And I definitely went wet into wet on the ladybug itself, so you can kind of see how the colors just run together in that shadow area. That would not happen nearly as easily on a regular piece of paper. These do tend to be a little bit shiny, so later on, once this is dried thoroughly, I will come through with a spray varnish by Krylon, either the Calmer varnish or the UV clear, which will help prevent against fading. But I like to have it nice and glossy, and I always use a spray varnish because if I brush on a varnish, it might lift some of the color in the ink. So I always recommend a spray varnish if you are going to go over water-based markers. And then I am using my Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed
proof white to get that high highlight. And I'm also putting it in places where I wanted it to be a little bit lighter, but not necessarily white. And then I'm coming through with my markers to color it again.
Okay, folks, here it is, the final piece. I had so much fun with this. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned a little bit more about Encausticboard and that you can see why I love this as a mixed media panel and especially for water-based markers. Thank you so much for watching. You have a fantastic day. Bye.